How's it going, folks? Brian Cusco here at Triple B. Today we are going back to the Herpeton Talks of 2019 with Mr. Nick Mutton as your speaker. Nick wrote the complete Carpet Pythons book. He's bred almost every species of python there is in captivity. He's been to Australia. You're going to want to pay attention visually on this one because there are lots of cool slides that he brought, and he's going to share all those with us. And I'm not going to talk anymore. We're going to let it get to Nick. You're watching Triple B TV.
Growing up where I grew up is not really a hotbed of herpetological activity, so you don't really have that kind of traditional, like most of us kind of had a mentor or somebody that kind of guided us in our early days in the hobby. And for me, there wasn't anybody around where I lived in Eastern Washington State, but Philippe, through his books and publications, really filled that void and really inspired me. And I don't really think I'd be here if it wasn't for those efforts he made back in the day. So thanks to you for that. A little bit about myself. I am a breeder of carpet pythons among other species, but carpet pythons have really been my first passion, and I seem to have quite a number of them. I was lucky enough a few years back to write a book on carpet pythons. Coincidentally, my co-author is Justin, who I will point to with a laser right there. He happens to be here talking as well, so that's kind of convenient. Our book recently just sold out, and we're working on a second edition. I greatly expanded second edition. Whoa, that's a lot louder. So a lot of these slides, many of them are images and things that are from the forthcoming book in progress. And with that, there's a lot of taxonomic confusion about carpet pythons as a species complex of 7 or 8 different species and subspecies, depending on how you look at it. What I'm going to do first, I'm going to go through is kind of a primer on the group and just kind of lay it all out, what it is as it has traditionally been recognized. And then at the end, I'll get into the current research that we are involved in for the book that kind of redraws some of that and draws some different conclusions and everything. So first, what it is, and then what it likely will be. Okay. One thing you really need to understand if you're looking at any sort of Australopapuan python clade is that everybody tends to think just instinctively that New Guinea is somehow this island and that Australia is a continent, when really it's all Australia. Everything south of the central Cordillera of mountains in New Guinea, everything south of that is Australia. It's called the Papuan Basin. It was forced up by that collision of the Pacific and Australian plates. And so biologically, everything south of those mountains is mostly Australia. It looks like Australia. And that's where you find tree kangaroos, carpet pythons, spotted pythons now, and all of these blue-tongued skinks, frilled lizards, all that stuff. You have a little patch of Australia that's in southern New Guinea because that bit of southern New Guinea is Australia. So when you wonder why there are carpet pythons in a couple disjunct populations in New Guinea, they didn't have to swim to get there. The sea level rose in the last, 6,000 years ago, you could have walked quite comfortably from Cape York, Australia to New Guinea without getting your feet wet. So this separation and this water in the Torres Strait is a relatively recent phenomenon. And so looking at it in the whole totality and biological context of all of it, it's important to realize that. So I threw that slide in there. It's a range map of all the kind of currently accepted or more or less accepted species and subspecies and their general distributions as it is now. This is just a quick cladogram that shows the divergence of living snake families. And if you look all the way up, I highlight it in red, you see Morelia all the way at the top with the other pythons. And that's how they relate to everything else. Pythons have 2 separate radiations. You have the Australopapuan python radiation, and you have the African and Asian python radiation. Those 2 parted company a very long time ago. What you see, there was a molecular clock run in 2008 in a really good paper, and it estimated the divergence time of basically all the Australian lineages at right about 35 million years. So basically, when the first pythons colonized Australia via Indonesia, what's now Indonesia, you're hopping from island, presumably mostly rainforest and everything, and then you hit a continental environment that has deserts. It's got all these different ecosystems and everything. So you see this rapid rate of diversification, and all the modern genera all come into existence about at the same time. So they walk in the door and rapidly diversify, exploit all these new niches and everything. And you see the carpet python lineage in red up at the top there. First species, diamond python, actually one of the first pythons ever described, way back in 1804. This is the southern, theoretically all of these are subspecies of diamond pythons, which is frankly a bit of absurd because they're kind of the odd cousin. They're the outlier to the group. They're not typical in many ways. They're diurnal, they live in a very cold climate. The black skin, all of that's adaptations to living in that cooler climate. I love that picture. It's so hard to find pictures of pythons and things like that, just in situ, unmolested, just doing what they were doing. I've got to really haul through. I got a whole lot of slides to get through, so these are only going to be up for a few seconds. Pretty typical diamond python habitat. Rock escarpments, rocky overhangs, and forest. This was taken just a couple of months ago by a good friend of mine, and I made sure he got me a picture before anybody touched it. That's just what it was doing. That log is in the middle of a creek with water flowing around it, and it was pretty cold outside, and it's sheltering inside this more or less insulated, rotted out log for its thermal properties. And you can see the black skin pretty prevalent. Another really great picture by my good friend Adam Elliott, who I've had the pleasure of going herping in Australia a few times with now. More typical habitat for this species. Carpet pythons are kind of a tree hollow specialist. Rotted out acacia. There's just a lot of rotted logs and rock crevices and tree hollows. That's pretty much their thing. I just love this picture, so I put it in there. It's like this picture's 120 years old. And it's a diamond. It was taken by some loggers, and they're falling trees 120 years ago, and it's a big diamond python eating an introduced rabbit. There's a problem with feral rabbits goes way back. So you're at like 1900, and it's already eating an adult rabbit 120 years ago, and just, I don't know. I like that. Anybody that's into carpet pythons or has much familiarity with them knows or has likely heard that they have an intergrade zone or a hybrid zone, depending on how you look at that. The coastal carpet python immediately to the north, and the diamond python, there's an intergrade zone, which is largely misunderstood by most people on the hobby side of things, and that they tend to believe that there's somewhere a place where diamond pythons are breeding with coastal carpet pythons, and it's really not like that. It's really the entire population are stable, more or less intergrade forms that are intermediate, that's just intergrades reproducing with other intergrades. And over a fairly short period of time, or space of time geographically, one becomes the other and they transition to coastal carpets. And the coastal carpets immediately on the other side of that are vastly different than a diamond python. You would never suspect that, their size different, their mating system is different, their skeletal structure is slightly different, everything is different. Another intergrade, this one from a little bit further south. And then we move on to the coastal carpet python. A lot of these were described in two papers in '84 and '85 by two Australian guys, Wells and Wellington. Those papers are not very well regarded, but they were the first people to really note population structuring within carpet pythons, which had all been lumped together under variegata or spilota up until that point. And while their papers lack much to be desired, the conclusions were not entirely wrong. So that's why their names have persisted. That is as the range is currently recognized all the way up to the tip of Cape York Peninsula and all the way from right around the New South Wales, Queensland border area, and everything from there up along the coast. Typically have red neonates, particularly in the southern portion of the range. My good friend Scott Eiper provided me with a few pictures of wild ones. He lives, I think there's a picture of one in his backyard, which we'll get to. Typical habitat shot, kind of dry forest, savanna habitat. Carpet pythons are, as a group, the most variable python in the world, hands down, end of story, microphone drop, done. There is nothing. They're like the eyelash viper or Amazon trebo of pythons. You'll hatch 20 of them in a clutch, and all 20 will look different. There's a weirdo in every batch, and there's almost no rhyme or reason to it. So that endless variability, as you look at all these same species, these are from the same place, from a very tight geographic area, yet they bear no resemblance to each other. They could be clutch mates for that matter. They also tend to habitually swallow very large prey. Ring-tailed possums are a favorite food, and that's a marsupial about the size of a cat. And clearly that one's had a pretty big feed before then. Riverine habitat. Another thing, just as a side note, since I'm prone to getting off on a tangent anyway, if any of you have never been to Australia to go herping, you need to stop what you're doing and make that happen. Like, it is the most life-affirming thing you will ever do. I really enjoy keeping and breeding reptiles as a hobby, as a business. That's great, but when you get out there and you feel the heat and the humidity and you see the trees and you find those animals in the wild doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's mind-blowing. And if you've not been able to do something like that in a place like Australia, it is worth whatever sacrifice is required to get that done. A very dark one. This one was found that's in situ, just where they found it, sitting on the ground on the trail in a national park, and I think that one's in Lamington. All the same species. This one's a little bit further north, but not a whole lot. This is in my friend Scott Eiper's backyard. That's his house. He lives in a suburb of Brisbane, and they're constantly in the city. And it's just literally in ambush pose in the tree in his backyard. And they're kind of like a lot of reptiles. Some seem to do better with human encroachment. Some even benefit, most don't. They seem to be one that fortunately can adapt to human encroachment and habitat destruction and live in secondary forests and backyards and roofs and things. Maternally incubating female hatching a clutch of eggs found in the wild. Okay, jungle carpet pythons, there'll be more on this one later. This is the one, if anybody's ever seen a carpet python in a captive setting, it was probably this. These are the yellow and black ones that everybody in the hobby tends to obsess about, even though I think and they just come from that small patch of rainforest. It's really the only real old growth rainforest left on the Australian continent. There's a tiny patch up at the very tip of the peninsula. If you look closely, as a bigger slide of it later when they talk into like the genetic side of things, but there's actually a bottleneck. You'll see about roughly 2/3 of that red area, and then there'll be a very narrow constricted point, and then another kind of opens up again for the top third. There's a genetic break point right at that that bottleneck right around Black Mountain or Coranda, and it comes into play with what we found later. That's actually a Tully locality animal, but it's a captive one. I really only put the one captive one in there just because that's what people think these snakes are supposed to look like. And having been there numerous times, the one thing I can assure you will never find in the wild is a fluorescent yellow and jet black snake. But through the magic of intensive selective breeding for endless generations, they're just all like that now, and everybody thinks they have it in their head that that's what they're supposed to be, and they're really kind of missing I've come to believe that they're almost missing out on the natural beauty and diversity that should be present because everything looks like this now. That's a wild jungle carpet. That's actually a pretty yellow one for a wild one. This is much more representative of what you would find. Typically the black and yellow-ish ones, brown and yellow. Anything with a tinge of yellow you typically find below that genetic breakpoint at Coranda. Another one. Black and gold is kind of the best you're going to find for a wild snake. Above that breakpoint, around Coranda, up around Gelatin, Cape Tribulation, Daintree, and all of that, you find a black and white jungle carpet python, or black and pale gray, such as this. And they seem to be much more consistent. This is one I found on my last trip up the Cape York Peninsula, right in the edge of Gelatin Township. That kind of olive green flaming up the flanks, very typical. And they don't seem to have quite the diversity of phenotype that you find further south. And yet another one from a different locality. All these are from 3 different places, but all are very similar. This is like the coolest picture of a wild carpet python I've ever seen, so I had to put it in. I just got this one from Scott. That is the prettiest wild jungle carpet, in my opinion, I've ever laid eyes on, and I really like that it's unmessed with where he found it, and it has no tail whatsoever. And I put it in there partly to illustrate that pythons have a hard life. Their food bites back. And finding animals with nearly no tail, that's because like a 1/2 inch of tail on a 4-foot snake. And it's getting along just fine, even despite that. Next we move on to the northwestern carpet python. This is variegata, which there's be much to talk about that. Mostly in the hobby it's referred to as the Darwin carpet python because virtually every captive one ever is from literally right around the town of Darwin. If you look at that whole red area, if anybody's been to Australia, they realize it's like There's a few towns, and the rest of the place, nobody's home. You can drive for hundreds of miles and see nobody. There's places you can go and see no sign that human beings ever existed, ever. It's kind of cool like that, they're huge unspoiled areas, but the only population center within their range really of any consequence is the city of Darwin, hence the name. That's a captive one. That's very typical Darwin habitat, dry forest. That's near Fog Dam. I took that on, I think, my first trip up. This kind of orangey brown, cream and black, that's the prototypical, when you picture a Darwin carpet or a northwestern carpet python, that's what you picture typically. And that, for a carpet python, strangely, they're not that variable. I mean, they are, but they don't seem to express the range of variation you see in the coastal carpets or some of the other forms. That's from Ubir Rock in Northern Territory. There's like 11 species of python you can find in that exact spot, like from that field of vision. It's crazy. It's the highest, second highest diversity of pythons of any place on the planet. Catherine Gorge, this is a considerable distance from Darwin, yet looks pretty much exactly the same. Litchfield National Park, I just got this image in situ, encountered at night in ambush position in Litchfield, just a little bit south of Darwin. A captive one. It's hard to find wild Darwin carpet pictures. So. This is one me and Justin found, actually. We got to Australia and everybody was so tired, but me and Justin were like, we're gonna go walk around. We literally found this carpet within about an hour of getting there. We're staying at like a bed and breakfast, and it's literally on this highway, and there's like what you call a gallery forest, which means like a 10-foot wide strip of trees that they left so you don't have to look at the freeway. And we're walking through that and almost stepped on a carpet python. Like, it's literally, its whole habitat was 10 feet wide by 50 feet long, and it was there hunting. It's like, and everybody else had gone to bed, and I was like, winning. So, all of you here, I'm sure, have that one species that's like just has a very special place to you. You know, it is probably different for most of us, but to find that one, that your first time you find that thing in the wild, it's like you're spiking the football and doing the happy dance. It's like this kind of herpetological high like I'd never experienced before. So, inland carpet pythons, definitely one of my favorite species. That a little bit more on that later. Basically, on the Murray, you basically have a mountain range that runs up the east coast of Australia and keeps the stuff on the inside from the stuff on the coast. You have kind of a green belt that goes around the coast, and then everything in the inside of the interior is pretty dry. Inland carpets inhabit the Murray-Darling drainage basin, which are two huge rivers that don't have a whole lot of water in them most of the time. It's mostly agricultural land now, so though they have the largest geographic distribution of any carpet python in terms of square miles, they actually have very low density and are very difficult to find in the wild. And it's a habitat that just seems to just barely be able to support some of them in some spots. So while it looks big, it's really, they're pretty difficult to encounter. Female on eggs. I'm glad these are finally in the United States and established. They have a kind of a bluish tinge to them. Anybody that's ever had a blue rat, like a feeder rat that was blue, they're that color. It's a blue snake. Small, incredibly docile. And that's about as full as that's ever going to get. Most of these rivers, some people don't realize in Australia, there's like the place is crisscrossed with 1 million rivers that never have water in them. A lot of climate change has happened in Australia over the last 30 million years since the Eocene. And it's just basically been in a perpetual drought for 30 million years. It just keeps getting drier and drier and drier and drier and drier. And now most of these rivers only have water in them on occasion, once or twice in a decade. That's a pretty exceptional specimen from the Flinders Ranges. It's kind of at the I included it with the inland carpets because it's probably an inland carpet, but this particular population genetically was kind of casually genetically looked at, and they show some evidence of at least swapping some genes with imbricata, the southwestern carpet python, from a considerable distance away, so they're a little hard to attribute. And they're incredibly rare and hard to find, and I was overjoyed to be able to get a picture of a wild one. Another one from Mount Meg from my good friend Adam Elliott. This is a cool shot. It's not like a cool photograph just because it's, compositionally not a very good photograph, but it's this very particular spot along the bank of a river in South Australia. And it's this heavily eroded rock face that looks like Swiss cheese with all these holes that goes through it. And birds nest inside that because it's very protected. And the snakes have figured out to just crawl through this and eat these birds. So they're like moving through these little micro caves. And it's a very small, very specific thing to this one little habitat. There was some field research done by some Australians there, and I was able to get some of their data and photographs. Bredli's python, this one's definitely my favorite. If anybody ever wants to get a carpet python as a pet, you could do no better. Big, rusty red, the most placid, docile, slow-moving. You're never going to get bit. You can't kill one to save your life. You'd have to hit it with a shovel to kill one of these things. They can handle temperatures down into the 40s. They're literally the most indestructible thing. They live in that little red spot in the center. They basically live in a desert that is surrounded and isolated by an even drier desert. So while it's dry where they are, it's even drier around there. So it kind of makes an island within a desert. And they basically, animals that evolve in a tough neighborhood have to be tough to survive. If you ever live in a place where it doesn't rain all year and then it floods twice in a decade and then it's 110 degrees in the day and you can see your breath at night, which it often is that, and they're just out in a rock pile somewhere. You've got to be tough to live in a place like that. But it is some of the most beautiful country you'll ever see. Huge sands and the red coloration of the snakes and the blue-tongued skinks and things that inhabit said area. It becomes pretty apparent why they're that color. This was another good friend of mine found one. This one, I've got another picture of it in here. There, that's the in situ before. So if you wonder what these things are doing when you're not looking, that's what they're doing. They're wedged into this rock crevice that's the same color as their body, hoping nothing eats them until they come out at night and maybe try to get a feed or something. Another specimen from another friend. Apparently all my friends can go to Australia and find a Bredli's python, but me that have dedicated decades to reproducing them cannot find one. But all my friends who have no field hunting experience just go and like, oh look, there's a Bredli's python, and they don't even realize it's a big deal. And like, ugh. They're one of those that you can't road cruise for because there's just not roads that go through these gorges. You kind of got to beat the bush, and that's definitely a harder way to do it. This is the same habitat that last one was found in, or just adjacent to it, in Trofina Gorge, and you'll scarcely find a more beautiful place in the entire world than that. That's one of my girls on eggs. They're all that color. They're not very variable. They kind of all look the same in terms of when they hatch, and some might be slightly brighter or darker, but they don't seem to show that much variation. They don't seem to show much genetic variation either because they have an incredibly restricted range. So that's probably not surprising. Southwestern carpet python, you see a lot of people referring to this as a subspecies. Those people are wrong. It was named as a full species. There's been ample genetic work done with it that shows they are unequivocally vastly different than all the others and well worthy of full species recognition. Interesting thing, you see the range has an 800-mile wide disjunction in it. That's the null arbor plain, which literally is Latin for no trees. And it's hard to be an arboreal snake in a place with 0 trees. It took a lot of research to figure out, but how do you have a population with an 800-mile gap in the middle where there's no habitat? And it turns out that happened about 15 million years ago. They've been separated forever. And part of that Miocene aridification starting roughly 30 million years ago, it just eventually got so dry that the dry center expanded out and eventually hit the southern coast and bifurcated the flora and fauna on both sides. There's been tons of work done with, there's been several molecular clocks done, one with a crayfish, a frog species, a legless gecko, and an acacia species, all of those that have similar distribution where they occur on both sides of the null arbor plain, and it all comes back. If you overlay that with the climate data, it all just falls like dominoes. It just gets drier and drier, and the first thing that goes away are the crayfish, and then the frogs, and they disappear in the order that they are dependent on water. And even if the last carpet python left in the last tree, it would have been about 14 million years ago. And that's the null arbor plain. This looks like a smudge mark, flat and featureless. That's all the academic justification for everything I just said. Imbricata in the western portion of the range, highly variable and absolutely stunning, some of them. I mean, that's a truly remarkable looking snake in my opinion. This is the Yalata Indigenous Protected Area. This is at the edge of that, at the eastern edge of the null arbor plain, where this is the absolute western limit of the eastern population of this species. Another wild one. This is from Western Australia. This is a Gammon Ranges locality animal, and though it looks like an inland carpet, it genetically keys out to be closer to it's from that, earlier there was one from the Flinders Ranges that was slightly similar looking. It's the northernmost extension of those mountain ranges, and they're kind of they're an area that needs to be further investigated and really needs to be looked at as to where to put them. I mentioned just a second ago, if there was the last carpet python in the last tree at the null arbor plain, that is the last carpet python in the last tree. That is the edge of the null arbor plain. 100 yards past that tree, it's sand dunes for 800 miles. And there's a tree, the last tree, and there's an imbricata climbing up the tree. I was like, Papuan carpet python, often in the hobby, these are referred to as IJs or Irian-Jaya, but no one should use that term because it's not real. Irian-Jaya is a province of Indonesia that stopped existing before these snakes even entered the hobby. It's like they came in and someone looked at an old map that was out of date at that time and just started calling them it, and it just stuck. So I feel it is kind of important to use proper terminology and stuff. The whole island is Papua. The people are Papuans. Most of the snakes are on the other side of the island anyway. So calling them Papuan carpets is probably a bit more appropriate. Named as a subspecies or species by Raymond Hoser, the infamous Raymond Hoser in 2000, but we'll get to why it doesn't count and it's not valid in a minute. Two distinct populations, that whole southern bit of eucalypt savanna, and then there's a disjunct population a considerable distance away around Port Moresby. They look very, very similar. There's not been much work testing to see within those two populations to see if there's much variation between them. There's also a tiny little red dot on the northern coast that's likely erroneous. There's a museum record for a carpet python found in that location 100 years ago, but it's largely believed to be erroneous. That's a wild collected one. They can be stunning, and that's a habitat shot from New Guinea, and you'll notice it looks just like Kakadu National Park in Australia, because it pretty much is that. This is another map of the Sahul continent, which is Australia and New Guinea. At glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, sea level's 400 feet lower. And I adjusted this map to correct for vegetation patterns at the time. The Gulf of Carpentaria becomes a series of brackish lakes, Lake Carpentaria and a few smaller ones. And looking at this, you can kind of understand the biogeography of a lot of other python taxa as well. If you wondered how green tree pythons got to Aru, it's because Aru is all connected. It's all one landmass up till 12,000 years ago before sea level starts rising. Carpet pythons largely prefer eucalypt savanna, and during the last glacial period in the terminal Pleistocene, you had a great expansion of that habitat type. So ice ages would probably tend to be very productive times for carpet pythons. Interglacials, probably not so much. Also incredibly difficult to find pictures of wild in situ carpet pythons from New Guinea. I'm able to fortunately find a few. Again, pretty typical dry woodland habitat. These are all from the PNG side. There's been a bit more field research done on the New Guinea side. Never into carpet pythons, but if you talk to people that are there doing research on venomous or birds or whatever, oftentimes they encounter these things, and you can get pictures from them. A pretty atypical specimen that I used to own came in as a wild-caught adult, gravid from the wild, no less, but very kind of atypical for the population. Oh, right. Man, I actually cruised through that faster than I thought. I'm doing good. That is the book Justin and I wrote that no longer, well, it's officially sold out. For the record, though, I have the actual last copy of it that I donated to the auction that Justin and I will both sign. It's the last one. I had one extra copy, so I figured that'd be a good thing to donate. We are working on a second edition, and I will get to that shortly. Now, that was how things were, maybe are, but probably aren't. This is preliminary, but to do this second edition of this book, we decided we were going to really just crush it to the best of our ability. I'm fortunate to be good friends with Dr. Warren Booth, who many of you probably know. And so after many conversations, I convinced Warren that he should run some carpet python sequence data, so we have some new science to bring to this book as well. It's just now getting underway, but I was able to get a couple things out of him that he'd just finished in time to put into this slideshow. And this is pretty much where we're at. We're planning on sequencing two mitochondrial genes and 3 nuclear genes, of which this is the first mitochondrial gene. And as you'll see, the groupings do not align with the current subspecies structure. It recovers coastal carpets as the most basal, inland carpets as much more closely related than all previous work had shown them to be. And then most importantly, and most operative, is you see that the variegata, the Harrisoni with an asterisk, and Cheney are all clustered very, very closely together. And there's very negligible difference so far in those genetically, and thus they all will likely need to be synonymized into a single taxa. If you look at a map, which conveniently enough I've got right there, all the tropical, wet tropics taxa from the whole top end across the Cape York Peninsula and up into New Guinea, from that whole tropical belt, all key out to be basically the same genetically. And looking back at the range map or the map of the continent from 12,000 years ago, you can see why, because all that was contiguous, all that submerged area was one contiguous belt of habitat with no discernible disjunctions or things that would hamper gene flow. So what is likely to be the case, and we need to finish sequencing the rest of the genes. There also was another paper in 2015, I believe, and they did a little bit of testing, and they also came to similar conclusions. So so far our data agrees with the limited amount of data that they published as well, and that you likely have considerably fewer species, with Cheney and the Papuan carpets all being absorbed into a much greatly expanded variegata, which you can basically, it comes down to, you can tell these things apart. They are distinct biological entities on their own little trajectories, but they have not had sufficient time to diverge to really warrant a taxonomic designation of their own. That breakpoint is right there where that arrow is. And you see the large block of rainforest and then a little bit above and a very narrowing of that. That breakpoint of the Black Mountain Corridor, you see that in a lot of other things as well. It's not just carpet pythons. There's unpublished data on scrub pythons that is ongoing. It shows the same breakpoint, that even though they even look the same above and below, they key out differently. And everything above is different than everything below. It's not an absolute barrier. I've driven right through it, and you almost don't notice you're going through. You don't notice that the habitat goes away. But it is sufficiently narrow to constrict gene flow in animals that are dependent on that habitat type. If I have the time, I put this stuff at the end because I think, man, I may not have enough time to get through all this. That's a selection of color and pattern mutations, and everybody in this room knows that, and maybe you all have your own opinions on the matter, that our hobby has been so fundamentally changed by this insatiable, incurable obsession with color and pattern mutations. And I think people have a tendency to look at that as only in the light that it's a positive, and in some cases I strongly feel it's a huge negative. And in carpet pythons, and I breed, these are all animals I produced. When you have a species complex of closely related species and subspecies, and you overlay that with a gene pool that can't be replaced, as Australia's reptile does not allow export of native fauna, you have a gene pool that cannot be replenished. And if you sacrifice everything at the altar of making morph combinations and hybridizing these things that you cannot replace, you're destroying the gene pool for everybody that comes after you for the sake of the trivial. And I don't know, I've just seen it go so downhill. I mean, it was always a little mixed up, but now it's like you can't trust anything anymore in the hobby, or very little, or very few people, because people have just willy-nilly bred every 2 snakes with a cloaca together for the sake of putting these 2 morphs in the one thing. Because unfortunately for carpet pythons, and reticulated pythons for that matter, the mutations tend to occur in different species and subspecies and populations. Retics are another example of that. There's probably a dozen species of retics when all's said and done. We can't import any of them ever again. The gene pool of retics in the United States is what it will always be, and it'll get worse. It can't get better because federally we can no longer import that species in the United States. I think at that point, any of us in the hobby who breed these things should try to act responsibly and try to best manage that limited gene pool that can't be replaced. It's like if we're going to hybridize every species of retic out of existence for the sake of making some morph combination that no one's going to really, frankly, care about at all in 5 years anyway. But what they will care about is that all these unique populations that we had, that we mismanaged and we didn't preserve for those who come after us. I feel like we inherited this awesome hobby, And now it's us to be good stewards of that hobby and to pay it forward a bit. So the older I get, the more I pay attention to what's the legacy that I'm leaving behind with this stuff. And I try to be on the right side of that to the best of my ability. To that end, I do these for every clutch I've produced in the last 15 years. This is the lengths you have to go to be confident your carpet python isn't a hybrid at this point. And that one's, I think, 7 generations back to the dawn of time for carpet pythons to keep track of this stuff. I found this to be the most effective way of keeping track of multi-generation ancestry information. But if you don't do something like that, I mean, how do you know what you have? How do you know what's related to anything else? And how do you manage a fragile and small, highly compromised gene pool? This was my solution, but yeah. And last thing, another little bit of research working on a group with Warren on monozygotic twinning in snakes. Stumbled onto this about 20 years ago. The carpet pythons produce monozygotic, i.e. identical twins, at an astronomical rate compared to other snakes. I've never had a year in 25 years of breeding where I did not have identical twins. I can't think of a year where I didn't have at least 2 sets of identical twins. I've had as many as 6 sets of twins in one clutch. I had a set of, I held back twins and bred them to other twins, and then you get boatloads of twins. I've had 4 sets of identical triplets, which are unbelievably rare. I've had 4 sets. I bred an identical triplet male to a female that was a twin. I got a set of triplets and 4 sets of twins in the clutch. There's clearly a hereditary component to that, which, and I've got a little theory that that it conveys some evolutionary advantage to it, because monozygotic twinning, unlike fraternal twinning, it is literally buy one, get one free. The female, you get 2 offspring for the price of 1 in terms of the metabolic cost of the female that produced that egg, if the babies survive. And what you look at with the twinning is that the carpet python species and subspecies that produce twins at a higher rate are the ones that live in slightly warmer habitats. You don't see it in inland carpets, and you don't see it in diamond pythons, very, very rarely. You see it, but only about as often as you would expect it in anything else. But those 2 populations range much further south, and it's much colder. And if you're an animal that's supposed to be 25 grams, you have a certain amount of mass and the ability to retain heat when it gets cold. If that twin is now 8 grams instead of 25, it probably can't effectively thermoregulate in those colder climates, and you don't see the twinning. Weirdly, the twins are always, the cumulative weight of twins, these things, is always considerably less than 1 normal baby. So if you average 25 grams for 1, the twins will be 10 and 11. They won't even add up to 1 baby between them. And triplets, it's even worse. Those triplets, 1 was 4 grams, 1 was 6 grams, 1 was 7 grams. All 3 of them together was like 10 grams less than 1 normal baby. They were intimidatingly small. But I think that's a little glimpse of one of these things. I'll publish it someday, I guess. But so, in fact, some of the sequence data for the book that were samples I sent him of the twin stuff, because the goal being to identify some sort of marker for why this is happening, because some lineages do it considerably more than others. I think that's it. I literally put a slide in and said questions. You, sir.
Thank you guys for tuning in. If you had questions for Nick, well, he's not that hard to get a hold of. Also, maybe I'd recommend coming to the herpeton that's going on next year. Just go to the link in the description and you can have access to all the minds that were there. Great people that have dedicated their lives to herpetology, whether it's the study of a certain species, the propagation of a certain species, or just spreading the knowledge and gaining more knowledge for the herpetology community. Next week, we're going back to the Pomona interviews. I'm going to have my buddy Forrest Fanning on the channel. He's going to give a very passionate talk about becoming a professional in the hobby. And until then, you've been watching Triple B TV. Y'all take care. Somewhere there's noise in here. Somewhere I just can't tell where it's coming from. I don't know. I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. I'm assuming you still see me. Freaking jacked up my, look what I did to my thumb just now. Right there, freaking pinched it on a stupid,